Bună ziua și bine v-am regăsit la Istorii cu Hodor. Astăzi avem un invitat foarte special, domnul John Florescu, româno-american, un om care a realizat peste 200 de spectacole de televiziune, un om care a intervievat în jur de 50 de șefi de state, de la Gorbaciov, nu?
De la Gorbaciov și american.
Președinți americani. Un om care este cunoscut poate pentru documentarele despre istoria României pe care le-a realizat. A realizat niște documentare foarte importante și premiate. Motivul pentru care l-am adus astăzi aici la Istorii cu Hodor, pe lângă faptul că chiar acum câteva săptămâni un urmăritor al canalului, un patron de-al nostru, chiar întreba despre documentarul Tovarășul, pentru că ăsta este motivul pentru care îl avem pe John Florescu aici. Ăsta este motivul pentru care l-am chemat. Vrem să aflăm de la el detalii despre acest documentar care a apărut relativ recent, care este distribuit pe rețeaua Voio, unde înțeleg că deja este în topul, bate orice fel de alt film documentar, indiferent că e vorba de Netflix, de HBO, de orice altă platformă. Așa. Bun, înainte de a începe discuția, eu o să adresez întrebările în limba română, pentru că sunt mai confortabil, deși poate pot să vorbesc în engleză, dar mi-e frică să nu fac niște greșeli, așa, iar John o să ne răspundă în limba engleză, cu care e mai comod. Poate o să mai intervin și eu în engleză când o să fie cazul, așa că nu cred că o să fie o dificultate să ne urmăriți în formatul ăsta. Bine ai venit, John!
Mersi mult, Madeleine, să fii aici și foarte mulțumim. Așa, a început, a fost în românește. Da.
Prima întrebare este legată un pic de trecutul tău și în fine, ideea de a face niște documentare legate de istoria României. Ce anume te-a adus aici? Ce anume te-a pasionat?
Uite, eu m-am născut la Boston, în Statele Unite. Familia noastră a plecat în 1941, când Antonescu a venit la putere aici în România. Bunica mea a fost diplomat pentru guvernul român și a fost la Berlin, la Washington și la Londra. Și când Antonescu a venit la putere, bunica, my grandfather, resigned, and the family was scattered outside of Romania. And my father, after he finished his studies at Oxford and the University of Texas, he became a student of Romanian history. He did it in part because he was forced to leave when he was 13 from Brasov in a train, one of the last trains out on the Orient Express in 41, just as the war was breaking out, and so he was put on a train. And him studying history was a way for him to connect to a country he loved. And growing up in the United States, in Boston, where my father's a professor, we were always very much aware of our Romanian background, but Romania was part of this world that in our school books, in the history books, was read like Russia. It was like the geography had it like, well, there's Hungary, Romania, but Czech and so forth, all part of the Soviet, the Iron Curtain.
Behind the Iron Curtain.
Iron Curtain. So we actually went back at the time because my father was researching a book on King Carol II, and so he had a Fulbright scholarship, and so we went back to live here for a year. It was a double joy, because we could see the country, that it much changed. Everything we had was taken away. Relatives of ours were put in the canal and other areas, so there was some pain to be had on our side. Everything my grandfather had was taken away. But it was a chance to see a new Romania, and it was a chance for me to see what it was like. In fact, in 1969, I met Ceaușescu because my father was invited when Nixon came on August 2nd, 1969. My father was a well-known historian, and the American ambassador, Richard Davis, said, could you provide some advice to the international media that was coming with Nixon. There were 300 reporters arriving with Nixon.
A fost o vizită foarte importantă, practic vizita lui Nixon în România deschide acea epocă de relații internaționale ale României cu Occidentul.
Exact.
Era un fel de vizită care gira politica independentă a lui Ceaușescu față de Moscova, era un fel de ușă care se deschidea.
There was an opening a door and opening a door to China, which we discuss in the documentary. Anyways, being surrounded by all these factors, I got interested in Romanian history. And my father was writing books. He wrote a lot of books on Vlad Tepes.
Yeah.
And I was finishing university. I was in California, and I was working for a guy called David Frost, who was a very well-known English interviewer who was extremely well-known in the English-speaking world. He did the Nixon interviews, which became a movie, Oscar-winning movie. And so when I came to Romania, we had businesses here, advertising businesses. I said, listen, I've done about 185 shows out of California and New York. Why not, in my spare time, do something in Romania? So I said, okay, I'll do that. We had people looking after our businesses, and if I had some spare time, I'd do it. And so I told my father, he said, well, why don't you go interview the king? Because the king of Romania, Mihai I, has an interesting story. He showed a lot of courage. And I said, okay, that's a good idea. I knew Princess Margaret, and I wrote to her, and she said she kindly set up an introduction. And I talked to him for a long time, for one day, and then the next day, and then a little more. And it was very interesting. It was just a casual conversation. Of course, we recorded it. He was there in his jacket, looking like an Englishman and sounding like an Englishman because his accent was so British. He reminded me a bit of my father in a way, because he's about the same age, and he had aspects that were very English, and my father was, because he had Oxford and high school in England. And then that was in 2003, and I sent the tapes back to California, and 10 years later, when I was back in 2013-14, I said, maybe we can do a documentary on the King Michael of Romania, because he showed a lot of guts, he showed a lot of courage, because he arrested Antonescu. And, Antonescu ended up being shot. It could have been the king who was shot if the day didn't go well.
Yeah.
So I interviewed a number of people. We went all over the world. We put the story together. I went to Pro TV. They said, this seems like a good story. They put it out on their air, and it had a very nice response, I should say.
Așa a apărut acel documentar despre...
That was the first one I did in Romania. And then I did one on 2 years later. It was 2017 now, getting ready for 2018. And I said, the 100th anniversary of the Union of Romania is coming up. Now, let's see, there might be an interesting story. So I called a friend of mine at Princeton University. He's a U.S. presidential historian, Michael Beschloss. And I said, Michael, could you dig into the files of Wilson, President Wilson, who was in Versailles at the time of the Versailles peace treaties? There were 80 countries that were represented there, and see what they say about Queen Marie and the Romanian delegation. So he calls me back and says, well, actually his chief of staff says quite a bit about it. So we looked into it, and sure enough, Queen Marie in Paris was making a big splash, a big sensation, because she talked well, because she was beautiful, because she was well-connected.
Was eccentric.
She was very eccentric, actually. And it was clear that she played a much bigger role in Romania's gift, if you will, of getting Transylvania back than anybody imagined. And so that was my opening. That was why I started, and then I did the thing at Queen Marie.
Înainte să începem discuția, îmi povesteai că au existat și piedici în realizarea documentarului despre Regina Maria, adică au fost niște lucruri un pic mai...
What does piedici mean?
Opposition to...
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, she's first of all a very inspirational figure. And Jan Pop at the Academy was very gracious, and he said, I think this is a film for the record. And one day the phone rings, and it's someone from Cotroceni, and they say, "Hey, this has got enormous publicity, and it seems like Jan Pop called it a classic or a film of the record," which was a generous phrase. He was very nice there. And but we think that Juvara, who you interviewed, was not exactly correct. It was his last interview. Okay. Was not exactly correct when he was talking about how Romanian Transylvania was. Was it more Hungarian? Was it more Romanian? Well, it depends how you look at it. You look at population. Do you look at cultural influences? Do you look at where they live in Transylvania? So, but what Juvara said, he said, yeah, it was more Romanian, but just by a little bit. So the advice from somebody at Cotroceni was, could you please take that away, that comment? And I said, can I ask who you are? And he said, well, I kind of work over here and I advise the president and so forth. I said, well, in all due respect, I think Juvara has a little more experience on this matter than you do, unless you tell me differently. And besides that, we usually, or we in fact never, make editorial decisions based on what people have told us within their goodwill and speaking candidly and openly, whether it be the President of the United States or the Prime Minister of England and so forth. Maybe they don't like what they said, but we never allow interference like this. So I'm sorry, we kind of go by different rules. And I don't think they liked it that much. And I remember they were dangling this. They said, well, we want to give you an award for your film, but that award disappeared.
Deci niciun premiu de la...
No award there that year. But the award was that it won at the TIFF Film Festival, it won the People's Choice Award, and it set very high viewing records on Pro TV, which was very nice. And I'm happy it was done. But that was a little bit of a funny little surprise.
Te așteptai la asta, dar acum ai făcut acest documentar care se numește Tovarășul, este despre facerea, mărirea și decăderea unui dictator, Nicolae Ceaușescu, un topic foarte sensibil în România. Recent am avut un sondaj de opinie publicat de INSCOP care arăta că procentul românilor care consideră că se trăia mai bine înainte de 1989 este în creștere, au ajuns aproape la 50%, undeva 48% din populație. Documentarul acesta vine într-un moment destul de delicat. Vechile nostalgii sunt redeșteptate, există o puternică coaliție anti-europeană, anti-occidentală care promovează acest narativ al nostalgiei comuniste, bineînțeles în scopuri populiste, dar istoria pe care ei se bazează este aceasta, a epocii Ceaușescu, iar Nicolae Ceaușescu este prezentat într-o formă foarte pozitivă în acest narativ. Tu ai venit acum cu acest documentar. Cum vezi tu lucrurile? Adică cum îl vezi după ce ai terminat documentarul?
I started it more than 3 years ago. The reason I did it is because I thought I'd done the king, I'd done the queen, and I said, why not the dictator?
Yeah.
Now, the dictator is not an inspirational figure like the queen and the king, but he's probably the most influential in the country, and his impact, probably carries on beyond 1989 in many ways.
Definitely, I just told you.
And so, and we get to the point today that his, you see polling. We had seen the same polling results that he was beating out all the other presidents in public polling since '89. So I said, I looked at a lot of the movies, documentaries, American, Dutch, French, English, Romanian. Ujica's movie was the first one I saw. And I said, I don't think anyone's actually told the whole life story. So how is it that a guy from Scornișești, small town in Olt, born the year Romania's union happened in 1918, poor, Romania almost disappeared as a country. It was reduced to Iași, basically, with the economic conditions of France in 1750, about the same level, people illiterate and poor. Yeah. How did this guy manage to rise to the top a very small communist party at the time, the numbers were small at the beginning, and consolidate his power, grab the stage in Romania from Dej, all of a sudden move out on an international platform, and then drag his country through many, many years of considerable hardship in the 1980s. And I said, and then got shot. A guy called Frank de Carter, who is a Dutch historian, wrote a book called Dictators. And in the book, he talks about 7 dictators of the 20th century. I looked at the book, and so there's Stalin, there's Hitler, the usual, and Ceaușescu was in there.
Yeah.
And I said, it seems like Ceaușescu's advisors, the people who are close to him, are still alive. At least some of them are alive. And it'd be interesting to talk to them, to the people who were near him, who watched him, who observed him. I hope they'd tell the truth. I hope they'd feel, that they're contributing to an absence of knowledge that needed to be answered, plus those people who were on the other side, people who were victims, people who suffered, people who, whether they be dissidents or whether they be regular people that had the hardships that everybody in Romania knows about. And so I said, I think this has to be done. So I started out looking to do 1 hour, and I've ended up doing 3 hours, or 3 times 50 minutes. And Voyo, the platform on ProTV, very nicely approached me and said, okay, we think this is an important documentary. And so that's where it is right now. And so it began on December 6th, and then it was on the 13th, and then it's going to on this last Wednesday, and on the 20th. It's 3 chapters. Number 1 is the growth of this person, how his life occurred, what happened, his time in jail, his time in the party, his time with amid the other leaders of the party who were basically being formed, and then, as I said, the consolidation of power, and then the downfall. So it comes at an interesting time now. I have been startled as I've gone around, talking about this, and we have quite a big team. It's a big project, at how so many young people don't know anything about the guy. I had a lunch 2 weeks ago, and the bill came to pay for the food. And I said, can I ask you a question, a word association game? And she said, yes. I said, how old are you? She said, 23. I said, okay, I'll give you the word. Nicolae Ceaușescu, what does it mean to you? And she said, she paused and waited about 3 seconds. And then she says, who's that? I said, this Romanian president. I guess you don't know him. It's okay. Then the guy with the POS comes by to, take my credit card. And I ask him the same question. And he says, oh, that was that great leader that went back to North Korea. Mm-hmm. I said, oh, interesting. And I noticed about 2 weeks before then, I was taking a taxi from Oradea to Cluj, and the driver was a football player, about 23, who played on the 3rd team of Oradea. So, bright enough guy. We're driving through the hills on the way over there. And I asked him the same question. He says, oh, yeah, he was the guy that came from North Korea, who came to create communism, and then they had to shoot him because otherwise, he would cause problems for the rest of us. So the level of knowledge about an individual who had such a huge impact on the country was rather unimpressive. Even Stefan Andrei, who was his former foreign minister, and a fellow by the name of Mr. Mihai Tatulici, who was a media guy here, and he had these secret interviews that he had with Tatulici, which he never sold, or anyways distributed. Yeah. And I said, listen, I'd like them, I'd buy them from you. And it's very interesting because Stefan Andrei was one of the guys that Ceaușescu,
very close.
Very close to Ceaușescu. He didn't like to contradict too much. And he said, someday people in Romania are going to wonder, this is after Ceaușescu died, he said this, are going to wonder what happened and what was this whole period about. And that's what I was responding to. So you asked the question, Eileen, are you surprised that the people of Romania, even half according to these polls, seem warm to the idea of communism? Well, you'd have to say, number one, that a lot of people don't know too much about it. So my film enters in this, this series enters into that context. And we notice among young people a very strong draw to it. I mean, I noticed that since the week or so we've put this out, it's like one of the fastest, it's number one
on downloads.
On downloads, on, you know, Voyo, ahead of all the other hit shows.
Yeah, and it's kind of...
So it's hitting a nerve.
Yeah.
And I think that the other factor is that a lot of people miss the good old days of Ceaușescu, the cleaning woman at our office. And she said to me, oh, yeah, she comes, cleans, I'm there sometimes early in the morning. She says, yeah, I used to go out to the Black Sea, and I could have, you know, a week there.
A
vacation. I had my apartment. We didn't have to worry about too much. Things were predictable. And so another thing that's, I think, fueling this curiosity is elements that exist today, which are high inflation, uncertain jobs, a sense of wanting to leave the country because, you know, you aren't satisfied with your living conditions. So these play into it as well. And they can move people to the right of the spectrum, particularly people who are interested or concerned about immigration, like you see in France, in French politics right now. You see it in Holland recently. You see it in Hungary right now. You see it in the election recently in Italy. So there is, you know, a lot of movement, I find, among the electorate. And I think it's also a function of technology and also COVID. Because COVID kept people at home. It kept people isolated. And technology allowed them to segment and go to outlets where they sort of hear, they sort of listen in a bubble. They listen to people that tend to reinforce their views. In the old days on the news was the news. In the United States, there were 3 channels. There's ABC, NBC, and CBS. And the news at nighttime kind of gave it very general, very straight, it seemed. Now, if you a little more to the right, you would be listening to Fox News, which has 3 times the audience of CNN. If you're a little more to the left, you'd be maybe watching CNN or MSNBC. What I'm trying to say is that people are living in silos, and they tend to reinforce and listen to people who tend to reflect their own views. And so I think that is a detriment in terms of broadening the knowledge base, so people have a baseline knowledge to be able to judge history, to judge politics, to look at facts, to look what is true. So in our documentary, we speak to a lot of experts, and I point out, I'm looking at one right now, who's been a huge...
de aceea te-am invitat, nu din motivul acesta te-am invitat.
And so, and I got your views. And so we also spoke to people who are like regular people. There's a lady that lives in Arad who is a mother, divorced, with 3 kids, and she talks about how difficult it was to raise a kid in the 1980s. You know, she talks about, you know, all the things that any Romanian who lived in the 1980s would know. Matei Cazacu, a historian who's in Paris now for many years, he said that the dictator was in a war with his own people. To go back to Descartes, who I mentioned, the Dutch historian, he looks at these dictators and he says they all have many things in common. Number one, they sometimes have difficult beginnings. They are the underdog. They're the underdogs. They develop resentments. They know how to keep themselves quiet. They set the objectives. They develop views, sometimes deep views, like Ceaușescu did, and we're quite convinced he was a strong communist or believe in Marxist-Leninism. And then all of a sudden, other things enter. The other things could be pride. They have proud people. They fear. They fear sometimes their own people, their advisors. The way they are feared themselves.
They're paranoid.
They become paranoid, and they become vengeful. So many of the attributes that dictators have, whether they be in Romania or Russia or other countries, They share many things in common. And we spot those as we talk to people around them. Even the aides would say they were afraid to meet with him because they'd go into a meeting and there'd be a secretary there and say, what's his mood like today? Is it up or down? Is he good mood or bad mood? And I remember Petru Ghigia, who was the Minister of Finance from 1981 to 86, and he said that, you know, we'd be at a meeting. He had 400 meetings with Ceaușescu. I said, what was it like? And he said, you know, I'd be there, Minister of Finance, important person, very key to a difficult time. And there'd be, let's say, the Minister of Health, and there'd be some other minister. And Ceaușescu would say something like, you know, I heard a report that the hospitals are dangerous in Iași, or something like that. And you, Mr. Minister, what do you know about this? Why do I have to find this from somebody else? Why don't you tell me? What is your job? You're a minister. Yes, you're a minister. What do you do here with the privileges that you have? You sit on your ass and do nothing? Do I have to call the prosecutor? Is that what I have to do? So in other words, a lot of these guys were intimidated. A lot of these guys didn't always tell the truth about things.
Mostly they didn't tell the truth.
Yeah, and I was talking to the head of the CIA, Robert Gates, who was Secretary of Defense under Obama, and I saw him out in Seattle, and I said, you deal with a lot of dictatorships around the world, the CIA, you know, dictatorships of the right, dictatorships of the left. What do they have in common? He says, essentially, there's a culture of lying. Because I know I lie, don't tell the truth, I suspect you don't tell the truth, and he doesn't tell the truth. So all of a sudden we live in a kind of fantasy world. And if there's a strong, you know, police force behind it, no one's going to take the chance of trying to break the circle of untruths. And he said the same thing was going on with Ceaușescu and you know, with other dictatorships they look at elsewhere in the world. So you look at the Romania today. I mean, I don't, in this documentary, try to give any historical lessons. I see an interesting story here. I think it hasn't been handled in a very kind of balanced way. I try to lay out the facts of what happened. I think I have the facts.
Aș vrea să te întrerup tocmai pentru că aș vrea să subliniez. Eu știu asta pentru că am discutat, aș vrea și audiența noastră să afle munca extensivă de documentare care a stat la baza acestui documentar. Ai mers în arhive.
Well, evident, asta este treabă enorm și dificil. Noi avem 3 persoane care sunt numai acolo la arhivă. De fapt, sunt la Gilava, sunt la Tiverea și sunt în 18 arhive în toată lumea. Este amuzant, fiindcă când am fost la Gilava, domnul care lucrează cu noi, aveți un loc acolo și toată lumea a crezut acolo că este angajat în Gilava. De fapt, este angajat de mine acolo, dar are masa, are computer, are scaunele.
Ce arhive ați
over there, Gilava, they have the video archives, which go back a long time until TVR essentially became the main deposit of information. So we went to Gilava a long time ago to try to get footage. Now, the difficult thing about that is that a guy who was an obscure peasant from there, that no one has a camera on him, no one is filming him. But we do see the first films and the first pictures of him when he was arrested. And he was booked, and we have his fingerprints. Cum se zice fingerprints in românește? Amprenta. And we have his grades from school. They were in Slatina. So we went to Slatina, into the archives.
Știi că există o problemă cu notele, pentru că ele au fost refăcute, adică notele ai în documentar ai găsit originalul notelor sau pe cele care au fost refăcute?
Da, este exact așa. A fost evident, este tot fel de domeni, matematica, geografie și religion, și că este religion. Și noi am văzut că toate cifrele au fost schimbat pe religion, fiindcă, de fapt, a fost foarte bun in religion. Ceaușescu did well in religion.
Yeah, that's a breaking news.
Yeah, that's breaking news. And then they changed it, because said, no, we can't have him being too good in religion. He's not going to be the Pope.
So they
downgraded his scores. And I was talking to his son, who doesn't appear in the show, Valentine. Yeah. But we spoke on a number of occasions, and I asked him, was your father religious in any ways? Because Ceaușescu's grandfather was a priest, and he built a church in Scornișești near where his parents are buried. And his mother was very religious and so forth, and or supposedly so. But he said, talking to his son about it, he said, no, at home it was essentially a cultural event. We had a Christmas tree, or things like that. But I think he respected the traditions of Romania towards the Orthodox Church, and obviously the deep roots and habits of the Romanians. Even I think in communist times, and certainly outside of Bucharest, people got married in Orthodox Church, even though it wasn't an accepted
position. A fost o situație destul de ciudată, pentru că deși linia oficială nu era nici de cum favorabilă practicării cultelor religioase, pe de altă parte interdicțiile nu erau atât de impuse atât de brutal. Era un pic o linie destul de gri acolo în ceea ce privește atitudinea regimului față de practicarea religiei. Și poate asta este o dovadă a acestei înclinații oarecum ascunse.
Și în documentar noi avem funerarii de mama și tata acolo în Scornișești. Și evident
sunt preoți.
Sunt mulți preoți, sunt mulți persoane și mormântare, și vedem pe față, evident, este a pain in the face. Of course, everybody has a mother and everybody has a father, and maybe the pain was there, or maybe he thought, who knows what's in his heart, what is in his soul. Did he believe what his grandmother taught him? Matei Cazacu was telling me that one of his colleagues in jail told the story of Ceaușescu saying prayers as a young kid at the house. But my view is that probably he was not religious. And my view, it was interesting to watch Ceaușescu carrying the casket on his shoulder, and you see in his face the brothers are holding the casket and they're bearing the mother and the father. So
ceea ce e un pic, e un pic așa bizar, pentru că una dintre caracteristicile dictatorilor despre care vorbeai, cel puțin a acestor dictatori clasici, Hitler, Stalin și așa mai departe, una dintre caracteristici era și faptul că nu aveau o viață de familie foarte bine structurată și organizată. Din contra, cei din cercul intim, familia, era adesea, trăia sub imperiul unei frici față de dictator. În cazul lui Ceaușescu pare un pic că era mai degrabă un tip care ținea la familie, adică era foarte apropiat de cei din...
Yeah, I remember the family was not poor by peasant standards. He was actually, Lavinia Betia, the historian who guided us very skillfully, she pointed out that they had 10 hectares, that they had a little water near their house. They weren't the poorest. They were sort of like mid-level. And they were 10 kids, one died. And somebody said, but they didn't have enough mamaliga to go for all 9 kids. There wasn't enough around. And so he left early and went to Bucharest. And it was really only his sister, Mihaela, I think her name was, that kind of kept an eye on him. And when he was in jail, he was in jail because it was very difficult for the family, and we spoke to members of the family, to go and travel in those days from Scornișești to Bucharest. It
was very expensive.
It was expensive, it was long, and they had to take care of the other kids. So a lot of the, it just seemed like a normal family situation. We got this one kid who's in jail. He got in trouble. He's paying the price. but we don't have time to go see him. So one of the daughters sort of made it her job to be the liaison. And she saw him, you know, he was all over the country in different jails in Brașov and Degămureș and Jilava and elsewhere. So I think that the question of isolation, isolation from the mother and the father was presumed to be an alcoholic, at least in later life. The mother, I think, probably was the kind of person that kept things together, but he decided and went on his own. And likely the influences that the other people who were in jail with, Dej and other people he was in jail with, was a more accepting, he's very close to Dej and had a huge impact and influence in jail with them all the time, studying, reading, and so forth, and not the interference of either a school or family or other perspectives. So you sort of get the feeling, I think, how this thing happened, how this little kid who walked to school, I think it was 2.5 kilometers one way and 2.5 kilometers back, how he sort of fell into this area. They say he apparently, when he went to school barefoot, without shoes, he would resent the children of more wealthy kids that had shoes. So he developed all these things early on. And so I think that helps tell the story why he is. I'm not saying that out of sympathy. I'm not saying that out of anything. But it's a circumstance. We all have parents that shape us a certain way. And we don't choose our parents. The parents are, and the circumstances are what we are born into. And so I think to understand Ceaușescu, and Matei Cazacu said this at the beginning, you have to understand the mentality of a peasant too. And the people that work with Ceaușescu were telling me this time and time again, a kind of doubting, you know, wait a minute, let me see, let me look at you again, let me see what you say if you mean it, a sort of doubting side. And also, I think by the time he was a teenager, he had very strong political views that were reinforced by what we call the mini Bastille in early years of incarceration, of jail.
Și practic Ceaușescu este produsul unei curent politic. El îmbrățișează comunismul, devine un true believer, pentru că într-un fel se potrivește cu ceea ce credea el, cu viața lui, cu modul în care vedea el lucrurile și găsește explicații și încurajare în interiorul acestui partid, care îi permite practic să își ducă la îndeplinire viața pe care credea că trebuie să o aibă, nu? Deci devine un luptător pentru o cauză.
They called him the proletarian hammer. That was a name that was given to him.
Ciocanul proletar pentru cei
care... proletar, because he was the kind of guy that people turned to when they wanted something done. Hey, you take care of this, Nicolae. And he wanted to show that he was tough enough to do that. I mean, he became a general by the age of 34. He actually represented...
With no military experience.
And then he represented Romania at Stalin's funeral. So here's a man who was already very solidly built in terms of what he believed and the ambition and drive and what he's prepared to pay for to achieve his objectives.
Crezi că are de-a face lucrul ăsta și cu precaritatea educației, pentru că foarte mulți oameni care, cel puțin în perioada ultimă a lui Nicolae Ceaușescu, cei care veneau în contact cu el, au vorbit foarte des despre lucrurile astea și au și pus multe din deciziile proaste luate de Nicolae Ceaușescu pe seama acestei lipse de educație, a unei gândiri primitive, fără să fie foarte sofisticată sau fără o expertiză, dar extrem de fermă în convingerile că are dreptate, că așa trebuie să stea lucrurile. Deci un tip extrem de limitat, care însă compensează această lipsă prin abnegația cu care își impune punctul de vedere. Și poate, într-adevăr, această trăsătură provine în această perioadă. Ceaușescu nu a considerat că trebuie să se educe, ci a găsit modul de a promova doar executând foarte clar o linie trasată, cu încăpățânare, mergând înainte pe direcția Ciocanului proletar, nu? Cam așa?
I think I got the basic. What's your specific question is?
Dacă această lipsă, adică dacă a compensat această lipsă de educație prin modul de a se impune, prin, cum să zic, tăria credinței în această cauză comunistă.
I mean, he was for a short while at school in Ploiești. And these people were kind of going through an education process. Some of them had a more strong Soviet influence, as we know, some of the earlier communist leaders, and others less so. His son told me that his anti-Russian Soviet feeling happened early on, when he was in Moscow, he developed an antipathy for what the Soviet Union was up to. He apparently, according to the son, said that those attitudes about the Soviet Union were developed while he was in the Soviet Union, because he thought that the interests of the Soviet Union were not the interests of Romania. And it's an interesting point of view. I have no reason.
Și nu lipsi de adevăr.
Yeah, and I think it's quite consistent.
It's quite consistent.
It's quite consistent.
True enough.
True enough, yeah. So he didn't have any formal education, although later, when he was elected the leader of the country in 1965, if you look at his grades, they were all changed to perfect tens.
Yeah.
And but he moved very quickly up in the political party. I mean, we saw his party card. In other words, what he was, everybody had a number, right? He was like number 215, then he was 112, then he was 60, then he was number 1. And if you look at that against a calendar, the guy's making fast progress in the party.
Number 1.
Yeah. I remember I was talking to Jean Maurer, who's the former prime minister's son, and he was saying he was apparently Maurer, the father, putting a lot of influence in terms of the succession of Dej. And what he said was that Ceaușescu is somebody that fits the bill. You can manipulate him a little bit.
Este asta o explicație pentru ascensiunea lui? Există această supoziție că venirea lui Ceaușescu la putere este de fapt rezultatul pe care acest grup de oameni puternici din partid l-au selectat practic pe Ceaușescu, nu pentru că era cineva, o persoană foarte inteligentă, sau din contra, tocmai pentru că nu era inteligent, și au crezut că selectându-l pe Nicolae Ceaușescu și punându-l secretar general vor putea mai ușor să manipuleze o persoană cu mai puțină pregătire intelectuală decât ai găsit lucrul ăsta, că ar fi așa?
Yeah, that's essentially what he was saying. Maurer was making the point to Dej, the circle of succession, that basically you could manipulate the guy, but he was for the right social origins. He was a peasant. He married a Romanian woman. Elena actually was a beauty queen in the early days, so a good-looking Romanian woman.
She actually won a beauty contest.
Yeah, she won a beauty contest, right? The kind of proletarian.
E greu de crezut, dar e adevărat.
Yeah, she did win a contest. In fact, we have a photograph of the two on the beach together, and she looks like his mother because he had kind of a young face, and she looked more mature. But that's an issue. That's a problem. On the Black Sea. So I think that what Ceaușescu was till the end of his life was pretty well shaped by the time he was in his early 20s. I think that the drive, the ideas, the characteristics, the price he would pay for moving through power. He saw how dangerous it was when he went to Moscow in 1957 for the celebration of the October Revolution in Russia. Dej was supposed to go, but Dej was afraid to go, so they sent another delegation, and that included Ceaușescu and Prioteasa. And so
you go, maybe the Russians will kill you.
Yeah. So Dej's instinct was pretty good. I think I'm going to take a pass on this. I'm going to stay at home and walk around Bucharest. But Prioteasa went, and the plane crashed.
Yeah.
I mean, it's an amazing thing. So this plane is landing in the fog of, I'm not saying there's anything that particularly mysterious about it, but it makes you show the dangers.
There's no conspiracy there.
Yeah, but it makes you feel like the dangers of this high political game. So Piateasa died. Ceaușescu, you look at the pictures of the plane crash, which we have in the film, and you say, how could anybody survive that? I mean, it's amazing. He came off without a scratch. So in a way, it seemed like a lucky man there.
That's a chosen one.
Yeah, maybe the chosen one. So, I think even they say about Dej that he was contaminated with a kind of uranium stone that was near him, and they kept it near him, and he got uranium contamination.
Există o teorie destul de prizată despre iradierea lui Dej de către sovietici cu intenție. Teorie care a mers și mai departe, cu iradierile și cu o întreagă... Dar povestea asta cu iradierea lui Dej de către sovietici, eu nu cred că este...
You don't think that's the case? We didn't think. We thought it was a bit of a stretch. A couple of people told us. We usually try to get sources. You were asking about archives. We try to confirm things 2 or 3 times, certainly if they're controversial. And we heard about that, but we decided as producers to leave it out. You know, you're telling somebody's life. It's a complicated life. It's a big life. We didn't get into the financial aspects of his... I don't think he was personally interested in money. I think in that way he was a peasant that had no idea of... I think he had all the luxuries of a dictator. He had a beautiful yacht. He had a beautiful house in Bucharest. But I don't think his natural instinct was of like the Shah of Iran. You know, I remember Sadat in Egypt was saying, well, they were on the Nile together and made the remark that you should have a beautiful boat like we have on the Nile. So, you know, he had a big boat. He had a fancy train as well that exists. But I don't think that was his style, and I don't think you become that way. You're either born that way. And so somebody told us a story about how when he went to the Waldorf Astoria to the United Nations in New York, he was giving a speech there, and they check in at the hotel at the Waldorf Astoria, and he turns to one of his aides and says, can you get one of my socks fixed? There's a hole in the sock. So the American guy hears this thing. He said, oh, God, this is the guy, the president of Romania. He said, oh, you know, Mr. President, you know, down the street, there's a place you can buy socks for like $5. So you don't need to fix the sock.
Fix the one, yeah.
But he insisted on fixing the sock. So I think it's a complex story. And the thing I understand is that the truth is in shades of gray. It's
not black and white.
It's not at all black and white. I would say even I was impressed at the intelligence of some of the advisors him. We had Sergiu Ciolac, who was his translator. Later he was an ambassador and then foreign minister after Ceaușescu. They were very shrewd observers. They were shrewd observers of their own lives. Some of these people didn't want to talk at the beginning. They didn't want to give their point of view. And I would say, well, listen, you know, this is the last train out of town, because this will be a very comprehensive thing. You had access. You were nearby.
That's the last chance you can tell your story.
Yeah, the guy's 80 or 90 years old. Now, some of them died while we waited. Some of them, their minds, like Coticianu, their minds seemed like they're slipping away. So we couldn't really have that as a guest. And some of them, I think, just said, you know what, I have nothing to lose here. I'm going to be dead anyways. I might as well give my point of view. And in a way, I think it was a liberating feeling. And a lot of these guys were quite critical of Ceaușescu. Now, you could say they did it because it served their purposes now. Here they are in the post-communist world.
Yeah, and most of the people do that.
Yeah, you see that in Hitler's time. You know, all these.
Stalin.
How did this happen? You know, but I think a lot of them were. I take the Gidja, and he was a guy who was well regarded as putting together budgets, And he was explaining that in the late 70s, Romania was doing extremely well economically.
Yeah.
It was called the kind of Japanese tiger. I mean, I think it had the third fastest industrial growth rate in the world. Now, a lot of that was coming from Western lenders. It was coming from the World Bank.
The numbers are correct because in the late 70s, Romanian export was basically 50-50.
Yeah.
In West and East.
East, yeah. I mean, so Romania was, doing extremely well. I remember coming here in 67, and I remember you could see oranges coming from Israel. It was a sort of like moment, there's a passing moment of liberation. I remember down at the Lido Hotel, the people were drinking, they were dancing, they had long hair, and there was a kind of perestroika atmosphere for a short period of time.
Yeah.
But to go back to the economics, so Gidgio was saying, Romania was actually doing very well. It was well regarded. And then the 80s came. And guess what? You had to pay the bankers. Guess what? All the debts were due. And so Gidgio's there talking to Ceaușescu, and he says, Ceaușescu says, well, I don't have to go through any, fine banks and so forth. There are 15 government loans, different governments, and I think 320 or 340 banks. And Gidgio had sort of arranged the payment terms to pay this money back. And Ceaușescu is saying, well, we don't deal at that level. We deal directly with the leaders at a bilateral, high-level head of state to head of state. And Gidgio was saying, well, that's not really how it works. Whether you have a debt situation, whether it be in Brazil or somewhere else, there are certain rules.
You don't talk with the president.
Yeah, you don't talk to the president. And so he was saying how frustrated he was because he couldn't understand. Because what Ceaușescu says, we have to pay it in 2 or 3 years. And Gidgio's saying, no, it's impossible to pay it. And there's something very touching, which I thought, because I thought that Gidgio seemed like a public servant. He said, I was asked 3 times for the job. I didn't want this job because I'm a banker. And I know the moment I started this job, guess who's coming to the door? All the bankers. Pay up, pay up, pay up. Time to pay up. And Gidgio is saying, an American banker from Bankers Hanover's Trust comes in. And he knew him because Petru Gidgio was in Washington. He was in the Paris Circle and so forth. There are different economic councils around the world. And he says, Mr. Petru, we were walking around the hotel last night, and we went by the meat stores, and there's no meat. There's nothing. And he said, it seems like people are kind of hard time. And Gidgio said, I dipped my head, and I felt shame because I knew why this was happening. I knew why this was going on. I knew he was correct. And I knew that 400 tons of pork were being sent from Galatz to Odessa, each year, whatever it was, and that we were doing this, and we were starving. We were starving so many Romanians. So it's interesting, when you present the facts to these people, because I said, Mr. Gidgio, you have to understand as well. You have people that live in your city. They know what life is like. Not the people that were in the elites of the nomenclature, but people that maybe you went to school with, or people you were friends with.
Yeah.
And they're telling you what's really happening. So how did you feel? What did you do? And so in a way, they kind of let it out there. I would have liked to do much more with many of these people, because I think they're speaking from an element of sincerity. They're trying to be a public servant in a way. Many were involved with a lot of, dirty business or funny business, I'm sure. We came across, it's interesting, Carlos the Jackal, who was an international assassin, and he's in jail in France today. And he was apprehended in Africa by the French authorities. They grabbed him and they brought him back to Paris, where he is. And Aleku Solomon, who's a documentary producer and a very good one, had done an interview with him by telephone. And it was interesting because in that interview, Jackal is trying to play cute. Yeah, I was in Romania. Nice place to be, No one asked too many questions. You can have meetings. And then he started mentioning all the key leaders of Securitate, who was his friends. Yeah, he was a good guy. He gave me a couple rifles and so forth. So here in Romania became a center for Jackal for about 4 years, where he undertook various operations, which you know a lot more about than I do, across Europe. Mostly failed, from what I understand.
Yeah.
I mean, he tried to do something with Radio Free Europe, but I understand it got botched up somehow. But so
They
Romania
bombed the wrong
location.
Yeah.
So so I think it's interesting to see the people who were close to power and how they dealt with my line of questioning. And I invited the patriarch of the Orthodox Church as well. I was interested to know what the relationship was between those two centers of power. They did not want to, the patriarch declined, but he sent me all kinds of papers that described what was going on. They were in a very difficult position because many of the Orthodox priests were imprisoned themselves.
Yeah.
When they built Casa Popoli, many Orthodox
churches
were destroyed.
Yeah.
So they were, but nonetheless, you know, the relationship between the Orthodox Church and the power was always much closer, let's say, than in the Catholic Church, where it's always more at an arm's length distance away.
Yeah.
So I guess, you know, there's a guy called Edward Beer. Edward Beer was a English journalist who wrote for Newsweek. He was bureau chief of all of Newsweek in Europe. And he wrote a book about the Ceaușescu period, and the title was Kiss the Hand You Cannot Bite. And he uses that to describe Ceaușescu. And I think there's a Romanian saying also that if your head is bowed forward, it comes...
Capul plecat, sabia nu-l taie.
Yeah, there it is. And glad you said that because it kept my Romanian. But there's an element that Romania accepts situations that maybe are not always in their interest. And I would say that observing many people who were around the production, there's almost like a schizophrenic element that people, you know, knew who their friends were so they can talk. This is during the 80s. They knew who they could trust. They knew who they could confide in. They knew who to avoid or when to keep quiet. And it created a kind of duality in people's behavior, which I've noticed myself. We also were told that, of course, the only way you could get even with Ceaușescu was jokes. And there are all these characters who were, you know,
trying to humor him.
Yeah, tried to humor him. And some of them were sort of acceptable, but you couldn't go too far. You couldn't cross the line. So I think that element of reticence in terms of openness, in terms of being cautious, in terms of, you know, as the Italians say, be silent before you speak. I think that's one of the overhangs of the regime with older people. Now, when you're very old, like the ones I had, maybe it's a sense of abandon. You don't care. Here we go. Let's say some stuff.
Și asta se întâmplă în documentarul tău. Adică ei au vorbit, de asta poate, și de asta merită văzut documentarul Tovarășul. Aș vrea, nu, din păcate nu mai avem foarte mult timp, dar aș vrea la sfârșit să te întreb nu știu, să facem un fel de evaluare și să-mi spui un lucru pozitiv pe care l-ai aflat despre Nicolae Ceaușescu și un lucru negativ despre Nicolae Ceaușescu din tot ce ai făcut în ăștia 3 ani.
What was a good quality and a bad quality?
Yeah.
Well, I would say, I mean, he had a sense, I think he loved his country. I think he, you know, in a way, in the way he thought. Okay, so I put that in.
That's a key
element.
Yeah. Își iubea țara în modul în care credea el că
yeah, probably the way he saw it. But I think he was, you know, I think he tried to advance what he thought were the interests of the nation, which they were not. He developed industries that could not sell products that would be bought around the world. Romania was trading you know, for technology with strawberries and, you know, fruits and so forth.
That's
to get
crazy.
heavy industry.
Asta ține și cumva de modul în care era el limitat, pentru că nu înțelegea niște lucruri extrem de simple, nu înțelegea the basic economics.
Yeah, I mean, it's what Jeje was saying. He didn't understand economics. I was trying to teach him. He didn't understand.
Ceea ce e o problemă când să nu înțelegi lucrurile de bază economice, devine o problemă când ești persoana care decide absolut totul în privința asta.
I think that was a major issue. Apparently, he had a very limited vocabulary. Professor Betty was saying he used basically 500 words, which were the same words used over and over and again. In terms of negatives, well, you know, he was a dictator, so I'm not into dictatorships, and I don't believe in dictatorships. I don't think it's what the world that, you know, if they want to say that, you know, communism, socialism is one thing, or socialism is one thing, dictatorships or socialist dictatorships are entirely another. And I think that at the end, he was so imbued with his sense of power that he didn't even see reality as it was. Even Gorbachev made that comment. We have a conversation between Gorbachev and Ceaușescu, and Gorbachev is saying, Mr. Ceaușescu, I have been in your country today. I have gone to beautiful markets, into factories. I see the richness and the happiness of the workers. But I know this is a show. It's a show for me. And I would say that I maybe understand your country better than you understand your own country.
That's a tough one.
And he said the only person who may understand it is your wife. Gorbachev to Ceaușescu.
Yeah.
And another fascinating thing in the show, talking in this case with the translator who lives in the United States, Gorbachev's translator, and there's a Romanian one called Stoica, is that when it was clear at the beginning of December of 1989, when Malta had, you know, taken place, where the superpowers got together, Gorbachev and Bush, and the road was over for everybody except Ceaușescu. He was still hanging in there. And now Ceaușescu finds himself in Moscow. On the 4th of December. Yeah. And Gorbachev says, you know, that you must understand that the world has changed, and you don't seem to quite understand that, was basically the message. And Ceaușescu, according to the translator there, said, we must save socialism. Yeah. We must protect the light of socialism, hold the flag up.
Yeah,
even if intervention was necessary, and he said, even military intervention, this is what the translator said, even if it was military intervention. So the man who went to Prague in '68 to condemn the invasion and the violation of the sovereignty of the Czech Republic was then now begging, reaching out to Gorbachev to save him.
Send the tanks.
At the end. Send the tanks.
In Poland.
Yeah.
Am făcut această, chiar aici pe canal, la Istorii cu Hodor, am avut un episod despre Moscova și ce s-a întâmplat acolo între Ceaușescu și Gorbachev și chiar am subliniat lucrul ăsta, diferența dintre cei doi lideri pe 4 decembrie la Moscova, Ceaușescu anacronic și încercând să-l convingă pe Gorbachev, adică neînțelegând acest drum al istoriei care se închisese pentru socialismul și comunismul internațional și propunerea lui Gorbachev să organizeze la București în 1990 un congres internațional al partidelor comuniste. Yeah. Ceea ce Gorbachev adică era o propunere venită era cea de neconceput. Yeah. Iar Gorbachev îi spune lui Ceaușescu, păi eu v-am propus vouă, liderilor din țările de est, v-am propus să ne întâlnim într-un congres și să stabilim asta acum 2 ani de zile. Iar tu ai refuzat. Acum, după 2 ani de zile, vii și propui un congres internațional. Era complet defazat.
I was when you asked a second ago, you know, what did he do good?
Yeah.
One of his members on the Central Committee, a guy called Dinos Suraru, and I asked him that question. You know, we have a lot to say about what went wrong and what he did bad and all that kind of stuff. But what did he do good? And he made the argument, you know, you can say what you will, but at least, you know, they built roads, they built blocks, maybe not the most beautiful blocks, but they built blocks. They built Casa de Cultura. Degrees were respected. The Romanian engineering degrees were respected all over the world. And he did that with a huge kind of, I think probably in the 70s when they had the fines. So in some ways, when I drive up from Bucharest to Brașov and I see there's not a road done, you know, you sort of have to wonder, maybe a little bit of pushing to get things done. Is sad that it hasn't increased at that pace. When I go around the country, also often I'm speaking at Casa de Cultura, and they're all like falling apart. Yeah. So I go to these, like in Pitești, I was out in the Danube Delta, and they're all Casa de Cultura built under Ceaușescu, and it's the best place in town for any kind of, you know, public gathering. I'm actually going to go to Scornicești to present the movie, the documentary in January.
La Casa de Cultură din Scornicești. La Casa de Cultură din Scornicești.
If there is one, we'll see if it's still standing.
Ok. Trebuie să ne oprim aici. Mulțumesc foarte mult, John, pentru că ți-ai făcut timp să vii și să discutăm. Evident că nu am putut să acoperim toată discuția despre acest documentar, care este 3 ore de film. Vă invit să-l vedeți pe Voio deocamdată și dacă poate o să-l vedem și noi în curând și poate după aceea o să reluăm, dacă și oamenii noștri de la Istorii cu Hodor vor dori o discuție ulterioară, să reluăm anumite aspecte sau să răspundem la niște întrebări pe care oamenii le au. Îți mulțumesc încă o dată pentru...
Thank you so much. I enjoyed it so much. It's good talking to an expert, and I've always relied very much on your judgment, so thanks again. Hopefully we'll do it again.
Mulțumesc. Asta a fost Istorii cu Hodor pentru astăzi. Vă mulțumim. Nu uitați, subscribe, susțineți canalul Istorii cu Hodor, fiți pe Patreon pentru că merită.